This video is the evolution unit, learning targets 7 through 8 on the evidences for evolution. Begin by looking at the fossil record. We're going to look at 6 different evidences for evolution. The fossil record is the first of those, and fossils, of course, are preserved remains of past organisms. It doesn't have to be bones, but in this case it is bones. If you'll see here, you have a whale skeleton, or an ancient whale skeleton. This whale is not currently living today. However, we can look at today's whales and compare with yesterday's whales, or many yesterday's whales ago, and see changes, see things that are different, and use that to track an evolutionary history. For instance, this ancient whale has hind legs. Whales no longer have hind legs. They have the rudimentary leavings of hind legs, which we'll look at in a minute, but they no longer have them. But if you go back in the fossil record, you see them on the more ancient whales. Here's kind of a artist rendition of this whale eating a fox. It probably wasn't called a whale then, neither was that thing called a fox, but we'll go with it. And so here you go. This is the proposed evolution of whales. And so here at the bottom is more modern whales, and as time goes back, you can see that the shape is really changing. Then here's your still has 4 limbs, and even back to where you have a more terrestrial animal. And so the idea is that whales have become more aquatic over the evolutionary history of them. Secondly, we'll look at geographic distribution as an evidence for evolution. Organisms from similar environments tend to develop similar adaptations for those environments. Darwin noticed this on his trip. I wrote here in blue the trip that Darwin went, and he saw these different animals. And you'll notice the armadillo, the anteater, and the pangolin, and the spiny anteater in Australia. All of these have very similar adaptations. They all look very similar, but they live in completely different places on the globe. This is an example of what's called convergent evolution, in that animals that live in similar areas tend to have similar adaptations. Another great example of this is the ocean. Think of the ocean. What is one adaptation that all ocean animals have? Don't say gills, because whales and sea turtles don't have gills, but they all do have flippers. What do flippers do? They help you move through the water. So fish, whales, sea turtles all have flippers, but they're not closely related on the evolutionary timeline. This is an idea of convergent evolution. You see this here as well with rainforests. These dark green bands here are rainforests. What types of organisms live in rainforests? Well, certain kinds of trees always live in rainforests. Trees did not travel on boats to Africa and to Southeast Asia from South America, but similar types of trees have evolved in similar parts of the world. Some types of monkeys also in different parts of the world. This is a picture of some serious looking monkeys. None of them look too pleased. However, you can tell that they're all similar. However, they're in completely different parts of the world. Another evidence for evolution. The third one is homologous structures. And homologous structures are structures that have a very similar skeletal structure, or whatever it is. If it's not a skeletal structure, but in this case it is, but not necessarily the same function. And what this shows you is that they all come from a common ancestor. Look at these different mammalian forelimbs. Here you have a dolphin. Notice you have the upper arm bone, the 2 forearm bones, wrist bones, and fingers. You have the same thing with the dog and the human. Well, they all use theirs for different functions. Dolphins to swim, dogs to do dog things. Humans have a very wide range of uses for their arms. Bats use their hand and their arms to fly. Something completely different than anything else. However, notice all these structures are very similar to one another, showing a common ancestry between them. This is homologous structures. Now that is contrasted to analogous structures, which are the opposite. Structures that have a very similar function, but not necessarily the same structure. So this is a great example here. Bats, birds, insects all fly. However, they all use a different structural component to do so. Bats use their skin and their hands. Birds use bones that are similar to the bats, but they use feathers, something completely different. And insects grow wings out of the back of their back. And so all of them have very similar selection pressures that led to the development of wings, catching prey, getting away from predators, that sort of thing. But they're all different structurally. Another example of convergent evolution. So vestigial organs are a fourth evidence. Vestigial organs are structures that are no longer used, but at some point in the animal's evolutionary past, they were used. Again, whale hind legs are the perfect example of this. All modern whales have this hip bone in the back that is evidence of formerly having leg bones. They no longer have them now, obviously, but they have those structures there. Humans have vestigial organs as well. Um, one of them is the tailbone. Humans don't have tails, or at least most don't and shouldn't, but they have a tailbone because it's a picture of our evolutionary past. We no longer have an appendix, or we have an appendix, we no longer need one. Our jaws are no longer able to fit in all the teeth that grow in. That's why we have to get our wisdom teeth taken out. But used to, they were long enough to do that. So vestigial organs are a evidence for evolution. Embryology, this is a study of embryos and how embryos at similar stages have very similar structures. And again, this shows homologous structures in these embryos. And so notice back here at this top level, let me zoom in a little bit, you'll see that all these embryos look the exact same. They all have these gill structures here. They all have a tail. Well, as they develop, they begin to see some differences. The fish just kind of straightens out, as does the amphibian. But notice, you get a rear limb here. Well, it's homologous throughout. Even though the rear limb in the amphibian and the rear limb in the chicken are two completely different things. And then the rear limb in the human is something completely different even more. And so these homologous structures where they're same structurally early on in the embryo stage, but later develop differently. And so this shows our embryology, our early development shows our evolutionary history and our evolutionary past. And so here's a better picture of that, a more accurate drawing of those embryos probably. And still see the same homologous structures. You see the gill slits, you see the tail. And so these gills develop into a different thing. In fish, they develop into gills. In reptiles, they develop into like the rear jaw bones. In humans, they develop into your inner ear. And so it's completely different structurally, or similar structurally early on, but turning into completely different structures later in life. And the last evidence is molecular evidence. This has to do with DNA, has to do with proteins, amino acids, any kind of thing like any kind of biochemical element. Here you can see that 100% of the genes that code for proteins are similar between chimpanzees and humans. 99% dogs, and going down to where there's only a 35% similarity between us and roundworms. This shows an evolutionary history. You can track this using a cladogram, which we've learned to do in the previous unit. And so here's the human at the top, rhesus monkey, lots of similarity, but less similarity between the human and the lamprey, for instance. And so this shows evolutionary history. It shows how things have changed over time.